Okay, so for next week, and that little chat, which was very useful, but has taken up kind of 15 minutes or something of my time, and obviously won't make great entertaining viewing or illuminating informational stuff for the viewers on the internet, but we will come back to this next week. We need to focus our questions. The BIRAM's coming up, which will then provide a time for lots of work or no work at all, depending on what you're planning to do. So I think before the BIRAM, we really need to be moving in certain directions. And there is this question of the primary source. You need to use some original source of some sort. And that's going to be the sticking point in a number of cases because of exactly what I mean by that. And I don't even know what I mean by that quite yet. So we'll work on that one together. Okay, really quickly, I want to re-examine this quotation from Bede, which Mustafa gave us before, and which conveniently we still have here. And I want to put it in a kind of archaeological context. And again, I think Alp's probably seen a version of this before. But anyway, here we go. Okay, so here is Bede, just after he's had that section where he's basically paraphrasing or plagiarizing Gildas and just changing the perspective so it's less anti-English. Then he has this description of the kind of physical, geographical origins of what he identifies at this point as the three main groups of English, so we say, to avoid using specific to English Germanic invaders. These newcomers were from the three most formidable races of Germany, Germania, let's say, not Germany, because that makes us think of the modern state. The Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. The Jutes are descended from the Jutes are descended the people of Kent and the Isle of Wight. So, hang on, I got jumping maps here. Let's go to this one first. You can? Sorry? Well, they're right up here. They're off the map on this one, up there, okay, the Orkneys. We won't worry about the Orkneys until we do the Vikings. They don't figure very much in European history until we do the Vikings. So let's postpone that one. So from the Jutes are descended the people of Kent and the Isle of Wight, okay, and the from those in the province of the Anglo-Saxons opposite the Isle of Wight. Okay, the Jutes on the continent, historically Jutland up here. Okay.
How do you pronounce that in English? Sorry, Jutland?
Well, I'd say Jutland. Now exactly what the Scandinavian Jutland or something like that, Jutland or something like that. But we all say Jutland. You use the Anglo-Saxon. English approach. From the Saxons, that is the country now known as the land of the Old Saxons. So hang on, that's kind of here. Came the East, South, and West Saxons. Okay. West Saxons became Wessex, East Saxons became Essex, South Saxons Sussex. So it's kind of this region there as it was in his time. Okay. From the Angles, that is the country known as Angelus, which lies between the provinces of the Jutes and the Saxons. So here, Angles marked in there. Okay. And it's said to be unpopulated to this day, I don't know what that means. Are descended the East and the Middle Angles. On this map we've got East Anglia, which survived as a kingdom for a while. The Mercians here, and the Northumbrians kind of pushing up there, so it's kind of there. So we've got Jutes and Saxons marked in kind of green, and then this sort of red is marking the Saxons there on our map. And that's more or less what our friend Bede has to say on this subject. However, archaeologists, being the clever people they are, have done a little bit more work and sort of tried to support or see what they can do with what he has. Here are a series of brooches, or brooches, which were used to hold cloaks together or something. In fact, the picture which, those kind of 19th century style romantic pictures of those two characters before, you can see they probably had a little brooch holding it there. And we found on the continent and in parts of England two very distinct, different kinds of brooch that were used. These ones called cruciform because they have a cross shape, and these ones called circular because they are obviously circles. So quite straightforward descriptive titles there. And these have a rather different or rather specific distribution pattern. The same applies, less clearly for me, to pottery. Okay, here are some certain kind of pots which have been found on the continent and in England and have a certain series of patterns, and archaeologists believe that they're slightly different from these pots. Okay, not always quite clear about that myself, but they feel that these ones have larger kind of patterns and things, and these have, for example, smaller little patterns on here and so on. So perhaps less clear to those of us who haven't studied them in detail, but still the same. And what happens is, when you plot the distribution of the brooches or the pottery on the ground on the continent, it kind of fits. So you find a certain group fitting here. Okay, which ones is it going to be? The cross-shaped brooches are here, and the circular ones tend to be down here more. So we could suggest that the cross ones are sort of Anglian and Jutish, and the other one, the round ones, are Saxon. And then when they go to where they're found in England, they kind of fit in as well. So you find the round ones here and the other ones there. So we won't go into the details. It's not perfect pattern, but there is evidence that the archaeological distribution of these two kinds of find correlate more or less with broadly the geographical definitions which Bede gives. Okay. Now, firstly, as a methodological question, before we think about fitting it into what he's saying, if we've got some pots or brooches here, and we've got similar or related patterns of brooches on the continent, what does that imply? What does that suggest to us in terms of what was going on? If we have two things which are similar in different places, what is the implication? What can we perhaps suggest?
Migration or trade.
Okay, migration, physical movement of people. When you move somewhere, you tend to wear whatever you were wearing and you take it with you. You don't get changed on the aeroplane or something into completely different clothes and get off the plane looking different. And then you end up taking the stuff and wearing and behaving in the ways that you had before. So it suggests some kind of movement. Or trade, okay? That the people in one place said, oh, we like that brooch. Let's buy lots of those off you. So there's not many people moving, but the things are moving independent of the people. The people go back once they've sold them to wherever they came from and so on. The assumption here is that it's a people movement, it's a population movement which is going on. And given what we know from our historical sources, the assumption is the movement is that way. And the correlation roughly of what Bede says and what the archaeological finds are saying, mostly in the southern part of England, I think, suggests that there is some support very roughly for the people that Bede mentions. Elsewhere, Bede does mention the Frisians, who we haven't mentioned much about today, as another people that contributed to the population of early England. And nowadays, at least, it's often said that English, modern English, its closest linguistic relative is Frisian, okay, which is still spoken by some people in this area. Okay. Sometimes the Saxon dialects are put in together with as well as a kind of group and things like that. So it seems that the Frisians were definitely involved in some kind of settlement of England, but Bede, particularly in this quotation, doesn't mention that, which may or may not be important. Okay, quickly moving on, because I want us to finish off in the remaining 20 minutes we have by doing a bit of DNA analysis. Here's a nice map which I've prepared myself. It doesn't really tell you very much now. Okay, we have, I hope, 3 articles written by geneticists of one sort or another, which I want us to have some discussion of specifics, but also sort of general patterns. So, Y chromosome evidence for mass for Anglo-Saxon mass migration, that was the first one I wanted you to read, a Y chromosome census of the British Isles, and then evidence for apartheid-like social structure in early Anglo-Saxon England, which is written by geneticists, but also kind of historian archaeology people as well. So that's a kind of collaborative effort, interdisciplinary thing or whatever. Hands up if you read these articles. This is... Yeah, that's my next question. First, put your hands up if you read the articles, okay? Which gives me an idea of who's working, firstly. Keep your hand up if you understood more or less what the articles were about. Yeah, okay, so I'll agree with that. Somewhere in the middle, okay. Obviously, these are not written by historians to a large extent. They're written by biologists, and they're written for biologists. So, as I said at the end of the class this time last week, you'll probably understand the first page or so up to a point, and you might be able to follow the conclusion and some of the results or whatever, but the bits in the middle with all the diagrams and listing the different alleles, or whatever you pronounce it, and polymorphic things and all that, we're not going to worry about that too much, unless you've got some background in biology and it helps or whatever. But these are very important, I think, because it's the past decade or so, we're realizing that, as I said, genetics, our own genes today, is another way of reaching in the past and looking at certain aspects of the past, particularly to do with population movements and things like that, demographics. It can't tell us necessarily about cultural differences and things at this stage. Who knows what scientists will be able to do in 100 years' time. But it tells us about groups of people moving around because they're taking their genes, meaning their DNA, not their clothes, taking their genes with them, and then obviously their descendants are inheriting them. These three articles all focus primarily on one kind of gene. That makes it a bit limiting. Which kind of genetic evidence are they all based on?
Y chromosome.
Y chromosome. They're all Y-based, which means what?
Comes from the mother.
The father, yeah, okay. Guys get it from their dads, girls don't have a Y, they just got the two X's. But that means it's kind of half the population. We've only got half the picture, unfortunately, okay? We need to have similar articles looking at the mitochondrial DNA, which we all get from our mothers, and then we could put the two things together to get a fuller picture. So here we're looking at men. Now this is partly, I think, to do with the ability of getting hold of the evidence and things like that, and not just because these guys are kind of sexist, like all historians have written about men in the past and women are not figured, and somehow it's even the same here. But it's only half the picture. That's something that we should kind of pick up on at the start. Okay, who wants to tell me about the first article, evidence of Anglo-Saxon mass migration? What are they doing here? Anyone remember anything? Anything that they're saying? And my map up there would be a little help if you had any idea where the places are on that and so on. Anyone? What did they do? What did they actually do? What's their methodology then here? What are they doing in this article? We don't have to get to the results yet. What did they try and do? What was their process?
Look at the haplotypes.
Well, yes, but before that, before they get to how do they collect their data? Then perhaps that's the point. Everything needs data. Everything needs information of some sort or other. Where do they get their data from?
Genes.
No, that's aDNA, ancient DNA. This is living DNA. So they haven't gone around digging up people and then examining their DNA, which is also something which is very interesting. This is to do with current contemporary DNA, Y chromosomes wandering around in the bodies of blokes in different parts of Britain. How do they get, what are they doing there? Here. They went to a number of places on a kind of rough axis, east to west axis across Britain, from the eastern coast right across into Wales, North Wales, and they collected Y chromosome examples of men living in those places. And I think the usual thing they do when they collect DNA evidence is men who believe that their families have been living there for a long time. I mean, I come from kind of here, okay, in Wales, but my dad, I know, comes from Leeds, but in fact his father came from Birmingham and things. So we are completely useless for these kind of people because we have no idea where our DNA really comes from. But if people say, well, as far as I know, my great-grandfather was living here as well and things, then there's a likelihood by that point that the family may well have been based in that place for a long time. Okay, you can't guarantee, but it's a pattern. So they collected the Y chromosomes from those towns, okay, places. Then what do they do? Anyone? Anything? Come on. Yes, they get some Y chromosomes from where? I think it was... Where else? They've got these people, these guys. They go and find some other guys from... Norway, so Viking thing, or whatever, Scandinavian bit, or whatever, and Friesland, which, as we just saw, Frisia, okay, one of these areas where there's a linguistic connection to English and where there's a possible Anglo-Saxon migration and so on, okay. Then they basically compare them and look for these haplogroups, these different similarities and differences, and what do they find?
There are some significant similarities between central England and the west England.
Right. So these guys and the Frisians, somewhere kind of here, okay, have got quite, their genes are not too dissimilar, their Y chromosomes.
Yes, but the similarities between people supposedly in Norway, something like this. And also they classified the places according in 7 British towns, and they...
Yeah, all right, that's a complicated table, don't worry about that.
But I think the most important thing is this tables, because when we are criticizing this type of researches, we are looking at this table.
That's the data, yeah, that's the...
Because the significant level shows how can we rely on this research or not. And so the table shows that this research is not so much reliable because of its significance level.
Okay, well, we'll come to that bit in a minute. We've got the connection or the similarity between central English towns and what we would call Frisia, Friesland is today. Where do these guys from North Wales, where do they fit in? What do they say about those? Sorry, poor Edgem's the only one doing any work. She's going to get full points for this. You get full points for this by answering the questions. Anyone else? Murat?
They did not find any particular, actually, any strong relation to mainland with those.
Yeah, well, yeah, these and kind of these seem to be different. Firstly, these are different. These are closer to what's going on down there. Okay, and then there's the Norwegian thing. I don't know exactly what's going on there. But now, this is England, and this is Wales. These are Anglo-Saxons. These are Celts. Ergo, therefore, what is the assumption? Well, we're not thinking about should be. We'll forget about what the historical evidence says. Let's just look at the DNA now and say, what does that say? These guys have got DNA which seems to be different from these guys, and these guys' DNA seems to be closer to the guys on the continent. What?
Came over and the Celtic people went.
Yes, or disappeared or something, or were killed or whatever. But they no longer, their gene pool seems to have disappeared from here, and they've got something different there or whatever, and there seems to be a connection there, and we assume there's a movement either that way, or as you're suggesting, this way and things. And then they say, okay, this seems to reinforce the old idea Murat was mentioning before, the two approaches to looking at Anglo-Saxon invasion. Was it a mass migration, lots of people coming in with a certain amount of killing going on, or was it, as we said the other day, love and peace, man, few guys arrive and kind of intermarry with the locals but impose their language and culture on them, and it becomes England, but it wasn't really anything very different from what was going on before in terms of the population. The genetic evidence here implies, or they interpret it, that there was movement, that the Celtic bit seems to be now limited to here. Maybe once it was there, but no longer, because these people have come in large numbers and brought their Y chromosomes in and kind of taken over genetically from a different population. Okay, and they've come in obviously from the continent because there's a connection there. Bless you, Chok Yesha. That's one interpretation. The third article, an apartheid-like social structure in early Anglo-Saxon England, based upon an idea by someone else as well, comes up with an alternative interpretation of the same pattern. Now, did anyone who's looked at this stuff get any idea of what these guys are arguing here? They're coming up with an alternative way of interpreting this pattern that we see on these maps. Apartheid, what does that mean? We don't talk about it so much these days because people in South Africa are all very nice to each other, but what does it mean?
Kind of conjecture or regime in South Africa, maybe like Netherlands.
Right, so yeah, European people, the dominant political and cultural group in what was then in South Africa 30 years ago and earlier, forced and made the, what we might call native or dominant African community to be treated as an inferior group, and they were kept apart in various cultural and political and social contexts and so on. Now, what they're suggesting is that something not too dissimilar may have happened in England, and when you get a social structure coming in, controlling the population, even if there's a minority coming in, it can, over many, many years, not over a couple of years obviously, but over a few hundred years, you will find that the small group is able to spread its genes more effectively because it has a social and political or cultural domination over the society. In this case, we're talking about Anglo-Saxon men coming in and obviously getting the best Celtic wives or perhaps or whatever, and the poor Celtic guys are losing out, and then they don't get to pass on their Y chromosomes over time. And so even a small group could create this pattern, they're saying, over a certain period of time. An originally small group of Frisian DNA could spread more effectively because the social structure was pushing down. The interesting historical support for this idea is that the Old English word for a Welshman also meant slave. And in the very earliest Anglo-Saxon laws, okay, the status of Britons, of Welshmen, is clearly below that of the Anglo-Saxons. So there's historical evidence that in some parts, for example in Wessex or whatever, people who were perhaps of British origin originally, Romano-British, Celtic, Welsh origin, whatever you want to call it, they were treated as kind of second-class citizens. And they're suggesting in that situation, the DNA may, over hundreds of years, the Anglo-Saxon Y chromosomes, the Frisian, whatever it is, would take over in a sense, and the Celtic ones would disappear.
So the Celtic people went extinct, basically.
Sorry?
They went extinct.
Yes, they were sort of phased out. Rather than killed within 50 years in an invasion, well, in this case it's the Y chromosomes were gradually phased out because they were kind of put down upon. What's going on, as I said, with the mitochondrial DNA and what the Anglo-Saxon guys are doing with the Celtic women is another issue. But here it's a kind of slow process of domination. Okay. Now I don't know, I'm not saying either of them is correct. We can vote on it or something. But I think it's interesting that something as theoretically as clear-cut as DNA, okay, which survives in all of us today, and we can see patterns, is still open to different interpretation. So we can't be sure. We can't say, oh, well, it's science, and that's exact in the way that history is never exact, and those guys with the test tubes are all very clever, so they must be right. Still, a lot of that material is open to an interpretation, and if we take one historical approach and connect it, we come up with one view. If we take another historical approach, we get a different view or something like that. So Now, Ecem, you were going to say you were going to some extent criticize. You had some comments about criticizing the first article. Is that right?
I wrongly explain what I want to say. That can I show? For example, while analyzing the differences and similarities between the chromosomes in the lands, for example, between South Wales and Norway, there are important, significant differences in the chromosomes. This shows that people from South Wales and Norway can't be from the same root, the same genetics, for example. So, how can we prove that there is a migration between Norway and South Wales and the same biological roots between these people, although there are some claims about this?
Okay, well, we need to. I'm not going to go into all the data. I've never looked at the tables in detail myself. You're doing more than I ever did. But yeah, I mean, you're to some extent saying, are the actual conclusions they're drawing here necessarily correct, and so on. The Norwegian thing is slightly out of the picture. That's a kind of partly as a control, I think, for this, and obviously because of as something we'll talk about in a few weeks' time, the Viking settlements and what the nature of that was, and that comes into the second article, which we don't actually have time to look at. My other comment is when you look at my map there, my lovely map I created. I've got this database where you can get a map and then you type in place names and they put them on for you and so on. The first thing that strikes you is obviously what? In terms of collecting data, in terms of identifying patterns and drawing general conclusions, what's the best thing to have in order to draw a very broad conclusion about something and identify general big patterns? You need lots of data, okay? If you have two things, you don't necessarily know whether they are relevant or not, okay? They may be exceptions to a rule or whatever. If you have 10 things, you might say, well, a pattern is emerging here, and so on. So to collect the DNA from a couple of towns in North Wales and 5 towns in England is a starting point and identifies something about what's going on here. Whether it tells you about what's going on here or here or here is another matter, okay? So in the time since they did this research, I think they've collected a lot more DNA from all over the British Isles and so on. They have a stronger picture, and I think we need to look at the fuller picture and see a bigger sense of what went on. And as I said also, we don't have the mitochondrial, the female perspective mixed in as well, so it's only half the story being told. Okay, we better stop there. I see it's coming up to 3:30. Before you go, for next week, we are looking at the early medieval church. We're going to do some religious stuff. General things about Christianity, but also late Roman and early medieval developments.